scheduling, if nothing else, we'll just keep pushing forward. So, hey folks, welcome back to the afternoon session of Social Networks and Health 2021. Really happy to have Cassie McMillan here with us today. I am David Schaefer in spirit, if he never makes it up in person. And Cassie is a new assistant professor of sociology and anthropology at Northeastern University. She's been working with us in the big sense of the Prosper Group on some of these things with multiple network things. And her and David have put together a really nice, I watched it last night. It was just impressive. A really nice tutorial and walkthrough of Siena, of some of the advanced features of Siena modeling, ranging from asymmetric effects and simulations. And the plan today is just give us a high-level overview of that and then have a discussion. So, Cassie, you want to take it away?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for that intro. So yeah, I guess to give a little bit of background, so when designing the tutorial, David took the lead on the asymmetric effects part, and he's really the expert on that. I know a little bit about that, but I don't know if I'll be able to answer all questions about that. However, the aspects of using SAOMs for simulation purposes, both just like your standard kind of simulations, as well as some different kind of advanced techniques that I introduced in the our lab for you all. I am happy to answer any questions about that, or to just talk more about anything, whatever would be useful for you all.
Awesome, thank you. So do you want to give a quick summary of some of the, just for those who might not have had a chance to see it, just a quick, like, when's it most useful, like what are the things to watch out for, those kind of things?
Yeah, sure. So I will focus on the simulation side of things. And in that respect, what we really covered there was thinking about different ways that you could simulate a potential intervention using SAOMs. So as you all probably saw in your lectures about SAOMs that started yesterday in the like kind of introductory lectures on networks and health, you probably were introduced to some of the ways that these methods can be used to simulate both the coevolution of networks and behaviors over a given time period. There's a variety of different ways you can do this, and if you want to just like alter something like the amount of peer influence, that's pretty easy and straightforward to do. You can just kind of go in there and change the coefficient and then see how that shapes something like outcomes, health-related outcomes such as drinking or substance use in your final sample. So that's pretty straightforward, but what I covered in my lab was looking at perhaps you want to do an intervention where you target certain students. So you have like a whole population of adolescents or something like that, and you want to target only a subsample of those adolescents, right? Because things like interventions tend to be very costly. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of money. So you often can't enroll everybody in your intervention. So in a project that David and I are working on, we've used SAOM simulations to try out a variety of different network-based methods for trying to find the most influential people in a network in order to reduce adolescent drinking. And I specifically focused on some techniques for inoculating those students. So the idea there is, right, when you have an intervention, the goal of an intervention program isn't just like, okay, right now when you leave, you're going to stop drinking or stop some sort of harmful health behavior, but instead they really want to instill within you in the long term like a set of skills or a set of techniques for resisting uptaking in that behavior either again or for the first time. So I covered some different kind of techniques to inoculate those individuals, which sounds like it should be pretty straightforward, but as I cover in the lab, it gets a little tricky because SAOM automatically centers all of your variables. So you might be familiar with the centering of variables, especially if you've worked with multi-level models. This comes up a lot, but also just kind of in your general regression models. Sometimes folks will center their variables in order to make intercepts or something like that more interpretable. So SAOMs do this by default. And a lot of the reason there is because of just like to help with convergence and to help the models run faster. So there's good reasons why this happens, but it does make it tricky when we want to do something like apply an inoculation to certain students, and we want that to be a measurable amount that us as researchers have already determined. So I covered some techniques to kind of work around these centering aspects of Sienna, and then I also kind of allude to how if you want to do kind of more advanced things too, in order to deal with some of the centering that happens under the hood, it's really necessary to kind of go back into the source code of SAOMs and the Sienna package. And I have some kind of techniques for dealing with that too that I'm happy to share with folks if folks are interested. So that's my little summary there, and I'm happy to turn it over to questions if folks have any questions.
Yeah, let's open it up. See if folks have questions on some of these simulation techniques for SOAMs. I'll start. The main sort of impetus behind some of these models is to think about ways in which, and for those of you that also got a chance perhaps to see this stuff on agent-based models, a lot of times in health intervention questions, what we're really trying to figure out is, how big an intervention might be if we do something. And so what the stochastic actor-oriented models really do a nice job of is making it easy to essentially turn parameters on and off. And so I'm curious if you've had any thinking, as you've been thinking about these models, about sort of the competing diffusions ideas. So we have a peer effect for positive effect, and perhaps then an intervention as well. Can these things have reinforcing effects or anything like that?
Yeah, no, so that's a really great question and a nice way to kind of tie both of the advanced techniques we did together. So when we were like going through this project and thinking about this, what we really did want to kind of simulate was this idea of an intervention that is teaching participants how to resist peer pressure, which we often think of as being negative influence. So, right, friends influencing one another to increase their drinking behaviors. And you can do that by differentiating out the two types of influence, as David goes over in the presentation. But unfortunately, and I think this is kind of like alluded to in the presentation itself, it's really difficult to get those kinds of models to converge on actual empirical networks. So we tried out some of that, but had kind of very little luck getting that to work across all of the networks that were in our sample. That being said, it's not impossible, but it was just kind of too much going on for what we were interested in the current project that we're working on. But I think that being said, I think it would be really interesting, especially like if you wanted to perhaps simulate an intervention that teaches students to resist influence from their more risky behavior friends, but become more influenced by their pro-social healthy friends. You could definitely simulate that as well by including those different types of influence parameters for increasing and decreasing one's behavior based on that of the behaviors of your friends. So I think there's a lot of potential there to kind of combine all of this and create really kind of nuanced interventions in a way that does a great job at kind of better modeling what's happening in the empirical world, which is always kind of the challenge of these simulations is, are we actually modeling actual processes that exist?
Yeah.
Or is this just kind of like, crazy assumptions that don't actually have any meaning to the real world?
Cool. Yeah, Benjamin, I see you said you have a question about generalized peer effects. Throw it out here and let's see if it lands on one of us.
Yeah, so it's unfortunately not so much under using Sienna for simulation, but more generally about just like peer effects. The one thing that I've spent a lot of time thinking about lately is that there's this entire literature in sociology and also in educational research that looks at classroom composition. And I just, from like you guys who are network researchers, like how do you make sense of this literature? Like what is a composition? Let's say we have a certain SES composition in a classroom. How do you combine this with this idea that, okay, we have this classroom, but underlying this classroom, there's of course also a certain network and there are peer effects running through this network. So how could we these effects that like the compositional literature finds will not be the same effects that the peer effect literature finds, but they will be related, I assume. And so, yeah, I'm just like having a hard time wrapping my head around that.
Yeah, so I think I'll take a stab at that first, and then Jem, you're welcome to add in. I think like you're thinking about like macro level kind of effects, like how does like the percent of students who are in like economically precarious situations, how does that shape kind of different health related outcomes?
Yeah, in a classroom setting. Yeah.
Yeah. So right, we have all those kind of macro level processes going on. And if you have just kind of one network, like, right, you don't have to worry about that too much because like, right, I guess it's a kind of constant, I mean, it's something you need to think about and it's shaping what's going on. But I think as you have more and more networks and more classrooms, then this like becomes increasingly interesting and something that you can kind of hopefully help piece apart too by having these different sorts of networks. Like, for example, right, like it's, I think Dan Reagan did a bit on meta-analyses techniques too. And right, by taking a bunch of data on a whole bunch of different networks and then looking at how these coefficients are both similar and different across the networks, also can potentially give you some leverage in tapping into these more macro level factors, such as whether or not, you know, the racial composition or SES composition of a network changes these different influence kind of coefficients. So right, perhaps it's like in more diverse networks, there's more or less influence. I mean, it would depend kind of, you know, on the outcome you're looking at, but like I could see hypotheses for either kind of direction making sense. But I think,
sorry.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to quickly interject on this idea. So, but like a Siena model, when they find a significant effect of my friend's SES, let's say, on my health outcome, that is in the end also an aggregate measure, isn't it? They will have like, let's say I have like 7 high SES friends in my network, and so it will be the cumulative effect of these 7. And so I'm not sure whether this is necessarily more micro. This is also kind of on some level like a cumulative effect. Yeah, so it's similar to a compositional effect. That's what I want to say.
Yeah, no, it's like kind of like the endogeneity of the two sort of things going on. That makes sense. And I think, right, it is kind of tricky to separate those two. And I like the best for doing so. Yeah, Jim, go ahead. You can add in.
No, I like thinking about this question, and I think that now that Cassie's point is an interesting one and might shed light on this, right? So you think about the traditional composition effect of what's going on in the classroom, on any single network, that's going to be a shift in the intercept, which is why you can essentially, you know, whatever it is, it's just a constant for everybody in the network because everybody's in the same classroom. When you have, so then we can imagine saying, well, we have a school network with 4 classrooms. So then it's no longer a shift in the intercept. It's a class variable shift. You could capture that compositional effect as 4 variables, 1 for each classroom, again, capturing all kinds of compositional things happening in that classroom. And that's where you would go for the HLM nested model. Whereas the network effect would be have the potential to bridge across these. And so if you keep thinking through this logic, then what you could imagine is that the most micro level of a composition is going to be the extent to which my peers' composition matters. And in that sense, I think a peer network sort of X effect, an exogenous peer effect, is really a just like a compositional effect. It's just a 3rd layer, if you will. And so if you really wanted to get nasty about it, you could imagine nesting kids in classrooms in EgoNets. And so you would have a 3-level, multi-level modeling effect that would let that happen, where essentially everybody in my ego network, all their compositional effects become something that is my main effect is centered in. My general instinct is that might be analytically correct, but pragmatically a nightmare to fit and just not worth doing. In which case, then I'd probably flip it around and say, well, if we really think that we want to estimate simultaneously a classroom composition effect and a peer composition effect on the same X variable simultaneously, and then we're worried about the confounding of that, then my instinct would be to turn it all into a network effect. And so what you would do is say the composition effect of me to my peers is just weighted more heavily in the mean that you give for the variable in the composition than you would if you took disentangled the two of them. So just from a pragmatic standpoint, I think that because each of my peers would be contributing simultaneously to the to the whole classroom effect and to my own effect, that if you just recentered that variable so that essentially I was tied, instead of having a value of 1 to every other kid in the school and divided by n-1, I have a value of 2 to my peers and a value of 1 to everyone else, still divided by n-1, or n-1 plus my ego network. And so you essentially get a weighted network mean for each person. And so then you end up with a center personed HLM, which is a little bit weird, but that might be the best way to, if you really wanted to sort of not double count it, that's how you would have to do it.
And can I quickly say something to this? So I'm interested in basically when this compositional effect that the compositional literature estimates, and when peer effect literature, when will these effects basically coincide? And basically, they would coincide if we actually, let's assume we have a classroom where only peers influence each other. So like I'm not influenced by anything else that's going on in this classroom, just by my peers. But my peers and the entire network structure is kind of isomorphic, that it doesn't, that it's not a special selection of people. I'm just randomly tied to anyone, and there's nothing specific about these friends compared to other friend groups or so. Then I would say the peer effect that we are getting and the compositional effect that like educational researchers would estimate would be exactly the same. Yeah, because basically I'm only influenced by my peers, but nothing about these peers is different from the classroom composition.
Right. No, I mean, the only reason that networks are going to differ at all from a composition is going to be because your peers are not a random sample of the network. If they are, then essentially you've just entered the variable in the model twice. So it's there.
Yeah, I wonder too if just kind of like by rewiring the network, you could kind of get at your question too. Because if you just like reassigned all those edges to be truly random, then if you're observing, I guess then in that case it would be if the peer effects are still the same, like then it's the composition. If the
that's a really fun, and that's clever, because that gives you that's a nice pragmatic way to essentially test. So you would test your real life coefficient for these two against what you would get under a known to be randomized effect. And that difference would be the part that's unique to the way that kids sort into their peers. Oh, that's a good idea.
Yeah, and we would still not know whether it's selection or peer influence, because it might be that like just the kids that I'm friends with are very different, or it might be that I'm more or differently influenced by my peers than to the rest of the classroom. But it would definitely show a difference between a compositional effect and a peer effect, right?
So I would, maybe, Cassie, you're better at this part of it than I am, so tell me if I'm saying something stupid, but my question, my sense would be that if you played the randomization game, you're breaking the selection effect entirely. And so if you run a Siena model over time, where in each classroom you randomly rewire kids, and then compare that to the real one, then you allow the Siena tools for disentangling selection from influence are true in the one case and known to have no effect in the second. And so still the differences would still let you get a selection and influence.
Yeah, and to kind of build off that too, if you use the simulation capacities within SAOMs, you could even like hold the selection coefficient constant, but then get rid of all the other stuff that like shapes friendship formation, like things like oh, people who drink are more popular, that kind of stuff. So you could get rid of all of that kind of stuff, but hold selection constant if that was something you wanted to do, or get rid of that entirely or change it.
One of the things I love about the simulation effects that coming out of the Siena modeling framework is that, in that little 2x2 of realism versus data, this is a very realist data-based model. But unlike the kind that you might imagine, programming yourself, the Tom Schneider's et al. And the entire crew that's been working on our Siena for the last 20 years have set it up so that effectively, like, the parameter space now is all you have to think about. So you can think about changing the parameters in the model specification, but all of those global process simulation elements about randomization, all this kind of stuff, like that's all done under the hood for you. So it really does make the ability to play these what if games so much cleaner than it is if you have to write the simulation from scratch. And the ability to do things, like you hinted at it right at the end, Cass, and you might want to say more about it because I think people might not appreciate how flexible these are. But you can do things like imagining, is it the case that peer influence is stronger in a hierarchical school versus a flat school? Well, you can change the triadic hierarchy parameters in the Siena friendship formation model and estimate that. And that's kind of cool.
Yeah, exactly. Because you can like simulate, you can fix coefficients, like certain coefficients, and then let the others like kind of still be estimated using the SAOM going on underneath the hood sort of stuff. So that's really cool too, because you can like fix some sort of social norm, but then have everything else kind of change according to what is being observed in the actual data. I think Shannon and Gabriel might have had their hands up too, if y'all have questions.
No, Shannon, you should go first.
Okay, well, I'll preface it by saying, Cassie, I'm very new at all of this, so I apologize for my naivety on it. But one of the things I was really interested in was thinking about what you were talking about in your video was, so it seems like it's multi-domain and that you're talking about a behavior, you're talking about something that's happening intrinsically in the person, but you're also talking about something that's happening on a social level. And I'm interested in also looking at what's happening on a biological level. So these three different domains. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you think about equivocating those or being respectful of the idea that they're different and how you kind of work that in your head on that model. Yeah, so yeah, really interesting idea to incorporate the biological kind of component in there as well. And I think so, the way that we're thinking about it, right, we hit like the kind of parameters we have is we have these individual level parameters, so things that have to do with individuals, and these can be social factors, so things like race or class or gender, things like that. But those individual level factors could also be things that are biological as well. So right, if you have something like a measure of someone's blood pressure or something like that, that could also be modeled as an actor level attribute, and you could use those same kind of actor level parameters to measure that sort of thing. So something, right, like, I mean, perhaps we wouldn't hypothesize that like blood pressure would be related to one's social ties, but we could include that in there. And I think this was covered, this was at least touched upon in some of the labs that you all have. But you also, one of the cool things about SAOMs is you can have multiple behaviors being your dependent variable at the same time. So right, if you're interested in something like how does, like you could have drinking be one of your behaviors as well as blood pressure being one of your behaviors at the individual level that you want to model. And then also have, right, your network component as well as one of your dependent variables. So there you kind of have these three dependent variables and they're all able to kind of interact with one another. So you can see, like, does your drinking level shape your blood pressure? Does the type of friends you have shape your blood pressure? Things like that. And I think that could be really cool. And that sort of kind of addition of that biological component has been really underexplored in the SAOM framework. I hope that helps answer your question. It very much does. You know, it's like one of those internal battles about, well, do I think that they're all, can I equivocate them all as being just, when they're in such different domains like that? It seems easier in my head to justify something that's something like a behavior like smoking or something like that with something that's going on socially as compared to blood pressure, and just thinking about how to do that in a way that's both theoretically and you know, meaningful. Having it be meaningful. Yeah. I mean, I think, right, getting the theory to kind of line up with what the parameters are saying, that's the tricky part. But I think if you figure out a way to do that in a nuanced way, that there'd be a lot of potential there for kind of thinking about how these
biological and social and network level traits all are kind of interacting at the same time.
Thanks.
Gabe, I don't think I have the context for your question.
For my question, yeah, my question. Well, actually, I'm really fascinated by. I would love to have a longer conversation about how you, like, as a practicing simulation person, sociologist, think about the sorts of like contemporary conversations or like themes that have arisen around behavior and individual level characteristics and structural characteristics, and the way that people have started to think about what does it mean to be, for example, of a certain race in a classroom, right? Beyond it being a person level characteristics, how is it like the echo of several contexts that are of like a collection of contexts and relationships that go beyond it, and it makes things pretty complicated from like a behavioral perspective, right? I think there's some criticisms about sort of like centering race, for example, within the individual himself. So that I would love to have a long conversation about that. But my actual question that's more realistic is I would love to hear. So I took a simulation class with Jim. We had a short course, and what I found the most difficult is sort of figuring out what too realistic is and what not realistic enough is. And if you could like walk us through your thought process when you're trying to determine what that perfect point is of not trying to reproduce reality, but having a good enough model of it that you could say something about the real world with it. Yeah, that would be really fascinating to me. Thanks.
Yeah. So yeah, first of all, first point, really interesting stuff. I think like relational ways of thinking about race are really interesting, and that would be a conversation I would love to have as well. So feel free to reach out and send me an email. So your second point about like, right, what is of a simulation, what's like too real versus not real enough. That's definitely been kind of a challenge, and especially with like the paper we have in addressing reviewers, they consistently kind of bring this up of like, oh, this is like, you need to incorporate this, this, and this, and like, or like, why are you incorporating that? So right, kind of walking that balance is difficult. And I think the way that I've like kind of approached it is, okay, what can we, like of the processes we're interested in, what can we empirically measure and what can we quantify? So for instance, like kind of with the work that we were doing, we were looking at so a bunch of different ways of like finding highly central or otherwise influential kind of groups. If you target those individuals, are they, for an intervention, you inoculate them, you reduce their drinking, all that kind of stuff. How does that shape overall kind of drinking levels? And one of the questions we continuously got was, oh, well, shouldn't you take into account like the fact that some people drank in the past and that might make them less kind of less like likely to uptake a sort of behavior, like and be more like have more positive effects from the intervention. And I think like, right, that's a good point, and that's like kind of complicated too. And there's like a lot of kind of conflicting evidence about the amount of the effect and the strength of that. And it's just very hard to quantify in a way that's meaningful and like that gives you an actual estimate. So right, by things like that, I think it's easier to just keep things simple. And like at some point you have to be like, okay, we're just gonna keep things simple because we have a bunch of different sort of things going on at once. And this is just kind of a starting point. Like, right, simulations are just kind of one tool in the methodological toolkit for thinking about things like interventions. And by just kind of like making up random parameters that you don't have a good substantive basis for and don't have evidence for why you did it, like isn't going to necessarily give us any new or useful information. So that kind of touches at your question. I hope that gives some sort of insight there.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I would just echo that. I think that's a great answer. I think the other thing that if you're going to do it, I mean, my sense, my general instinct is if you're going to do a data-based simulation of the kind that Siena is, the purpose is to sort of think about, you know, what it has to say about the actual context, setting, behavior that you're dealing with. And so the beauty of of using a Siena model where everything is estimated from the data is all the covariance structures, all the means and moments, all that kind of stuff are given from reality. And what you're doing is changing one aspect of it at a time. And with the implicit assumption that essentially everything, all the second order moments and such stay the same. It's just that you've just shifted this one element, and assuming that the social process and all that's there, but it tells you what your estimate means in a way that's so much more elegant than just trying to play it out in your mind on the table, because it builds the feedback loop into it. In contrast, if what you want to do is really play out a theoretical point, then going to the corner cases is what's fun and interesting, and the toy models are more useful for that. So it's really a case of, I think, trying to figure out what's the purpose of the simulation. Do you want to tell people that, what's the, is there any way to distinguish homophily from transitivity? Well, that's a toy simulation model that you can play with. If you want to say, should I, encourage kids to avoid peer influence at level 1 or level 8 of a known to be effective intervention, then that's a reality-based question. So
there's one last question. Benjamin actually asked it quite a while ago, so I want to bring it up.
Yeah, please, I missed it there.
Waiting. So I'm wondering about the steps you would take to evaluate intervention, modify it, and then continue to monitor its effects on influence selection in an interactive, pragmatic way.
Yeah, so are you thinking, I think if I'm understanding this correctly, the idea is do an intervention where you do something like inoculate all the students, change it around, but you want to see kind of like how influence and selection play out differently after doing the intervention. I think that's what I'm kind of thinking you're thinking about. So there are ways in the SAOM framework that you can keep certain variables constant when you're running the models, just like in step 1, step 2 of the SAOM. And I think if you go to the Sienna manual and look at this, it'll be more detailed than what I'm going to briefly kind of summarize here. But you can set certain coefficients and keep them constant, while let others like kind of fluctuate based on what you're seeing in the observed data. So I think there'd be some cool ways that you could use that kind of approach to see how something like making all the popular kids no longer drink, like how does that change things like influence and selection in your network by setting those coefficients to be fixed. And I think it's like really simple code to do that. Like you just add an argument to the function where you're like setting the different effects, saying like this is fixed at this number, like this isn't fixed, or in the algorithm function. I don't entirely remember, but it is outlined really nicely in the Sienna manual.
Great question.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking of it kind of like in a adaptive trial type of scenario where perhaps you don't know the best intervention or maybe the best order of the components of the intervention or something, and you want to test a certain variation of the intervention, see what its effects might be, and then change it and kind of modify it as you go.
Yeah, so you can, it's also possible to do that too. And I think kind of in the code, we sort of show a way that you can do this by trying out different kinds of interventions. But like, again, you can also just like have your starting point, like your baseline kind of estimates, change like change either the distribution of the individual behaviors at the start, change a coefficient value, and then, see what the output is. You run the simulation for, you can decide how long. It can be the same length as the study, or you can even increase the length if it's something you want to see what happens in the long term. And then like after that's done, Sienna will output all of this different information for you. So for each, you get like the distribution of every actor's individual behavior. You get the actual works that are simulated as well. And then you also get like a ton of other information about like every single micro step that happened in between all of that time too. So you can do that and like, get all that information, collect that, take whatever you want out of it, and then go back to your starting point. So step 1, and then again, change the parameter you want to change. Like maybe you want to increase something by 1 step or whatever, and then do that all again. And then, you just have a bunch of kind of data, and you have to figure out what to do with it.
You have a bunch of data, you have to figure out what to do with it. Is probably the big summary sentence for the entire workshop. So there we go. All right, thank you very much, Cassie, for doing that. And I'll let you deal with David ghosting you in the process of being here on your own. So that's well, hopefully he'll show up in an hour. Got the time zone wrong. So all right, I see Brea just showed up.
Hi, everyone,
Thank you so much. We were supposed to have a 5-minute break. We ran this one a little long. Do folks okay just to keep going forward? We're on Zoom, so if you really need to step aside for 3 seconds, do. But otherwise, I think